I thought I'll tell you about my research, which I think is quite exciting, and it has made national, international press, but often people don't really understand, and they misquote and they're misled and so on, and it's a very hot topic. It's all about obesity. Okay, so in 2007, 3 years ago, I was part of this particular science paper, which was titled "Common Variant in the FTO Gene is Associated with Body Mass Index and Predisposes to Childhood and Adulthood Obesity." Okay, and in the abstract, if you just can have a quick look, it says that, it does make it clear that it's a variant, so it's just one little tiny bit of DNA change that just predisposes you to having slightly higher risk of being obese, both as a child and as an adult. Now this led to some headlines in the national and international press. Says there is an obesity gene, the fat gene. Scientists find the gene that makes you fat, okay? So this is how it's all been picked up. Doctors find the fat gene. So it's making it sound as if it's like one big fat gene, that you have the gene, you don't have the gene, and therefore you're either fat or you're not. Which is nonsense. That is kind of not exactly the message of this paper. So what this paper actually does talk about is certain variants, okay? So these are small base pair, one single base pair change in your genetic code. So say if you have ACTG in your, as we saw in your genetic code, and for example this T changes to A, so that some people have ACTG, other people have ACAG. Okay, so that's the single base pair change. And it's really interesting because it's such a tiny minute change in the millions of base pairs in your genetic code can make the difference whether you have a disease or not have the disease. But we distinguish between these really, really rare changes, which we call mutations. So you can write a mutation in your sticky note. Okay, you can just write one. So we have mutation.
So just on one sticky?
Yeah, just on one sticky, write a mutation. And we can also have on the other sticky note, so just put that one to the side, write down a variant. So just variant, DNA variant. Okay, so mutations are rare, and when they occur, they cause major diseases. But variants are common. So some say maybe 20% of the population will have a T, and 80% of the population will have an A. And these cause sort of single gene disorders, but variants, depending on which one you have, they'll just predispose you to certain things. So we have predisposition, and this is cause. Okay, so again, you can write quickly causal and predisposing into different sticky notes. So as I say, there is no, what we discovered was not the obesity gene. Now, have you heard of monogenic and polygenic diseases?
I probably have, but I can't.
So can you guess what monogenic...
So monogenic would be one gene and polygenic lots of genes.
Exactly. So we have single gene disorders, which are often referred to as monogenic diseases. We have certain other diseases where there's lots of different genes with small changes in these predisposing variants that all add up to predispose you to that disease, and it's a polygenic disease. So one example of polygenic disease would be type 2 diabetes, because there is definitely predisposition to it, because we know it runs in families, but we also know that there is a lot of environmental influences. And just as we have type 2 diabetes as a polygenic disease, we can have polygenic traits in humans. Height. We know lots and lots of genes influence height. Another one is obesity. We have people on different scale of obesity. Of course, a lot of that has got to do with how much you eat and how much you exercise, but what we show in this paper, and this is the first gene that we found the variant in, which actually determines if we have, for example, a normal distribution of weight in a population. So this would be weight. No, that would be weight. Sorry, yes. From, I don't know, 30 to 300 kilograms, and this is just the frequency in the population. Okay, so we've seen over the last 50 years that this whole distribution has shifted. So people have got fatter on average over time. That's all to do with increased nutrition. But what this gene does is determines on which bit of distribution you are. So for example, if it makes you fatter, it makes you there. Or presently, you're here. So it's still, that gene doesn't change, doesn't explain this massive, boom in the obesity in the general population. It just determines this variant that we've described in this paper, just determines whereabout on this distribution you are. And that's one very sort of difficult sort of concept for the general public to pick up on, and this is where all these headlines got it wrong, because they're saying that we've explained this, the fat genes, so we just, discovered why people are getting fatter. It's not that, it's just we've, found the gene which is just making you slightly more likely to put on weight or not.
I have a question. So are you saying that distribution, the shape of it, has been the same over the years?
It has pretty much been the same, yeah.
So you're not saying that gene, that variant, is now more expressed than it used to be?
Exactly. Right. It stayed exactly the same in the general population. The frequency of it hasn't changed. That's a very good point. It hasn't changed. What's changed is our nutrition and lack of exercise, and therefore, even though the frequency is the same, we've just shifted overall.
Do you know what it actually codes for?
This gene is not known. It was first described in a mouse which has diffused toes. So the way the mouse looked had nothing to do with obesity, and it was a real puzzle. And obviously, to make it into science, we had to do some other studies to show that it is expressed in right tissues, and it is expressed in brain. So we're now thinking that it either has something to do with appetite or more likely with metabolic rate. There's still the studies are going on, so for the last 3 years, lots of groups have been working on it and trying to find out what it does, but it was total surprise. It was completely surprise finding, but it is the first ever, common variant found to be predisposing to general obesity. How am I doing for time? Okay. An interesting thing about this variant, we found it by looking for genes that predispose to type 2 diabetes. Okay, so this was one of our, as we say, top hits, because we interrogated many genes, and this was had the second highest effect on predisposing people to type 2 diabetes. And just playing a little bit with the data, we said, okay, so what happens if we adjust our results of this effect, if we adjust by BMI, just to make sure that none of these variants are actually doing anything to BMI, but they're really having an effect on your insulin secretion or insulin sending, so it's really to do with diabetes. But when we did that, this particular association went down to nearly zero. So after adjusting for BMI, the association between FTO variant and type 2 diabetes disappeared, which told us that it's predisposing you to diabetes purely through its effect on BMI, and therefore as a secondary, because obviously if you have higher BMI, you have a higher risk of diabetes. So its effect on diabetes is purely secondary from its primary effect on BMI. So that was another sort of interesting twist to this whole study.
So type 2 diabetes is where you basically wear out your pancreas by eating too many carbohydrates?
You either wear out the cells, because the insulin-producing cells, because they have to work extra hard, but also it's you get insensitive to insulin. So exactly, so you start releasing very little glucagon and so on in response to insulin production. So it's both. It's interplay of both.
Can this So this variant is always present. It can't. Can it change over the years?
No,
Can someone
exactly. So
develop?
this is the genetics. This is your own inherited genetic makeup, and it stays with you throughout the whole life. So in one person, this it wouldn't change. This variant wouldn't change, but it is prevalent at quite high frequency, and we thought that it might have been beneficial in the past. When the food was scarce and so on, and if it's something to do with metabolism and being able to store more fat for the calories you eat, then it would have been beneficial in the past. But of course now with too much calories available, it's not.
So do you think there's a gene that codes for something down the other end? Or variant?
So this. So you can look at this particular variant as coding both for being obese, but you can equally look at it the other way and saying coding for being lean, because there's only two different options, and if, one is making you fatter, but you can say that the other one is making you leaner. So when we talk about a gene for something, what we really mean is that gene has a function, and if there is a change, that function changes. We just say, so the frequency of these particular variants might be 50-50 in the population, or if it's quite rare, then we say that that mutation is obviously causing a disease or predisposing a disease. Equally, if the variant that is associated with leaner mass was maybe quite rare, maybe we can say the other way around. This particular gene is for being lean, but as it is, it's obviously a much better headline to say gene for being fat.
Does that annoy you though that they've taken that out of context and now?
It's been great publicity, so of course, we've been on the news and stuff like that, but sometimes the scientists themselves are often guilty, because when they give interviews to the press, they simplify things, but also what my experience has been, that the press who's interviewing you is almost trying to put words, because they know what headline they want, and they almost in the interview trying to say things which are not actually factually correct, just so they can quote something simplified and therefore actually incorrect.
Yeah, well, we stopped.
Yeah, so